first episode, we asked this long question. What if the voice begins with the person? Then we looked at what happens when conditions change. You can know technique, practice the technique, and still find the technique becomes harder to access when pressure enters the room. And in the last episode, I told you why I eventually stopped studying just the voice. So perhaps we can ask now a simply uncomfortable question. What are voice lessons actually for? Most of us would probably give the same answer: to become a better singer. And of course, that's part of it. We want better pitch, more range, more stamina, a more reliable voice, better technique. But after many years of teaching, I've come to think that something else can happen in a voice lesson. Something that has very little to do about whether you can hit a particular note. Because when you work closely with your voice, you are also working closely with yourself. Let me give you a very ordinary example. Imagine a singer working on a phrase that has been difficult for her. She knows the phrase is coming. Before she even sings it, something changes. Her breath becomes smaller. Her neck becomes a little more active. Perhaps her jaw begins to hold. Her attention moves away from the whole phrase and towards the one note that she is worried about. Then she sings it. The note doesn't work. And almost immediately she says, sorry. She tries again. And this time she works harder. More support, more effort, more control. And the cycle begins again. Now, there may be a perfectly legitimate technical problem here. Perhaps the coordination isn't secure. And perhaps the registration needs work. Perhaps the singer is using too much effort. Perhaps the breath management isn't appropriate for the phrase. A good voice teacher needs to be able to hear those things and work with them. So this isn't an argument for abandoning technique. But there is something else happening in the lesson that is worth noticing. The singer isn't only producing a sound. She's also responding to difficulty. And that response is information. What happens immediately after the missed note? Does she apologize? Does she laugh? Does she tense? Does she push harder? Does she stop? Does she become quieter? Does she immediately ask, what am I doing wrong? Or does she pause, breathe, listen, and try to understand what happened? The same technical problem can sit inside very different patterns of behavior. And those patterns matter. Here's where I think voice teaching becomes particularly interesting. Suppose we are working on breath management. There is a technical reality here. Breath is part of vocal function. The singer needs an appropriate relationship between breathing, pressure, and vocal fold activity, as well as the demands of the phrase. But imagine that the singer's breath is perfectly adequate for most of the song, and it changes only when she reaches the phrase she expects to get wrong. Now, the question becomes more specific. Not simply, how do we improve your breath? But, what happens to your breath when you anticipate difficulty? And that is a difficult question. It doesn't require us to decide why the singer does it. We don't need to say, you're anxious, or you're afraid of failure, or this must come from something that happened in your past. We don't know that. What we do know is what we can observe. The breath changed. The shoulders changed. The jaw changed. The effort changed. The singer's attention changed. That is enough to begin with. And this is what I mean when I talk about recognition before correction. Before we rush in to fix something, we first become curious about what is actually happening. Because sometimes the most useful thing a singer can learn in a lesson is not another exercise. It is, oh, that's what I do when I think I'm going to fail. That moment of recognition can be surprisingly important. Technical teaching gives us tools for changing vocal function. We can work with vowels, registration, resonance, breath, articulation, onset, phrasing, coordination, range, stamina. All these things matter. But a voice lesson can also become a place where a singer begins to understand how they use those tools. For example, two singers might both tighten their jaws on a difficult phrase. Technically, the visible problem may look similar, but the experience may be completely different. One singer may have simply developed an inefficient movement pattern. Another may notice that the jaw begins to tighten only when she feels she has to get the note exactly right. The technical intervention may be different. The learning process may be different. And the teacher cannot know the difference simply by looking at the jaw. And this is why I became increasingly interested in what happens around the voice, not instead of the voice, around it. What is happening with a person's breathing, their attention, their posture, their sense of effort, the circumstances in which they are singing. What do they notice? What do they expect? What happens when something doesn't go according to plan? These questions don't turn a voice lesson into psychotherapy. They simply give us more information. And the singer remains the expert on their own experience. I can observe a change in breath or muscular effort. I can hear a change in coordination. But I cannot look at someone's voice and announce what is happening psychologically inside them. That would be a very different thing. So, the person-centered approach isn't about interpreting the singer. It is about including the singer. Here is where one of the most important ideas in my teaching comes in. Recognition, understanding, choice. First, recognition. I notice that my breath changes before this phrase. Then understanding. I've noticed that it happens when I start anticipating the difficult note. And then choice. What happens if, instead of trying harder, I change how I prepare? Perhaps the singer takes a different breath. Perhaps she changes the vowel. Perhaps she reduces the volume. Perhaps she isolates the interval. Perhaps she stops and resets rather than repeating the same unsuccessful attempt 5 times. Perhaps she simply notices what is happening without trying to change it yet. That is choice. And choice doesn't mean that the problem disappears immediately. It doesn't mean that the singer suddenly becomes confident. It doesn't mean that the high note magically appears. It means something very important has changed. The singer is no longer completely inside the automatic pattern. There is now a moment in which something else becomes possible, and that is why I say recognition creates choice. This is also where my work with different disciplines begins to make sense. Somatic voice work taught me to pay attention to the experience of the voice in the body. Neuroscience gave me another way of thinking about learning, attention, motor coordination, and changing states. Psychology helped me understand that singers don't arrive in the studio as blank slates. They arrive with expectations, beliefs, habits, and ways of responding to difficulty. Jinshin Jutsu gave me a traditional framework through which I could pay attention to breath, touch, bodily sensation, and the idea of life energy. Now, these aren't interchangeable explanations, and I don't believe that they need to become one system, but each one taught me to notice something, and that changed how I taught. I became less interested in asking, how do I make this voice behave, and more interested in asking, what can we notice here? That question is deceptively simple, because once we start noticing, we may discover that the voice is telling us something about how we are approaching a task. Maybe we are pushing. Maybe we are holding. Maybe we are rushing. Maybe we are trying very hard to get something right. Maybe we are withdrawing because we don't want to get it wrong. And sometimes, perhaps, we discover that what we need isn't another exercise. Maybe we need rest. Maybe we need a different learning environment. Maybe we need a different technical approach. Maybe we need to ask for help from someone outside the scope of voice teaching. The point isn't to find a deeper explanation for everything. The point is to become better at recognizing what is actually happening. And this is probably the biggest change in the way I think about voice lessons now. I don't see the voice as a problem that needs to be solved before the person can get on with their life. I see the voice as a doorway. Through the voice, we can notice breath, movement, attention, effort, habit, expectation, expression, and sometimes simply the way we respond when something is difficult. That doesn't make singing therapy, and it doesn't mean that every vocal difficulty has a psychological explanation. A technical problem is still a technical problem. A medical problem is still a medical problem. And when something falls outside the scope of voice teaching, it is important to recognize that and to refer appropriately. But there is also a great deal that can be learned simply by becoming more observant. And that is where I think voice lessons can become surprisingly powerful. So perhaps we need to rethink what we mean when we say, I want to become a better singer. Of course, you may want more range, you may want better pitch, greater stamina, you may want a more beautiful or expressive sound, and those are legitimate goals. But perhaps progress can also mean I recognize what happens to me when I approach a difficult phrase. I can tell when I'm starting to push. I know when I need to stop and reset. I understand what helps me access this coordination. I can make a different choice when the old pattern appears. I know when this is a technical problem and when I need to look beyond technique. That is also progress. And perhaps it is progress that lasts beyond the particular song that you are learning. Because you're not simply learning what to do with your voice. You're learning something about how you use yourself when your voice is asked to do something that matters. This is why I don't think voice lessons are only about producing a better sound. They can become a practice of self-understanding. Not because singing reveals some hidden truth about who you are, not because every vocal problem has an emotional cause, and not because a teacher can somehow diagnose your life by listening to you sing, but because the very act of singing gives us a very immediate way of observing ourselves. You can't hide from your breath when you're singing. You can sometimes hear when you're pushing. You can feel when you're holding. You can notice when your attention disappears into one difficult note. And you can discover what happens when you respond differently. That is valuable information. And once you have that information, you have something that you didn't have before. Choice. So perhaps the purpose of a voice lesson isn't simply make me sing better. Perhaps it can also be help me understand what happens when I sing. Because when you understand that, you can begin to make different choices. And those choices can improve your technique. They can change the way you prepare. They can change the way you respond to difficulty. They can change the way you experience your voice. And sometimes they can change the way you experience yourself. That is not a replacement for technique. It is not a replacement for therapy or medical care when those are needed. It is simply a bigger way of understanding what can happen when a human being works with their voice. We began this series with a simple idea. Most people begin with the voice. I begin with the person. And perhaps we can now take that one step further. The voice is never just a voice. It is a sound produced by a person in a particular body, in particular circumstances, at a particular moment. And when we learn to listen to all of that and not just the sound, we may discover that a voice lesson can give us far more than a better voice. It can give us greater recognition, greater understanding, and greater choice. And that ultimately is what I want Vocalogy to be about.